Good morning, everybody. Hello.
Yes, good morning, doctor.
I want to check whether you hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, we can hear you.
We can hear you very well, doctor.
Yes, we can hear you. Morning.
Morning. I want to check to make sure that everybody is hearing us.
Yes. Good morning.
Yes.
Morning.
I want to check and see. I seem not to see Professor Richard Taylor online. Oh, Richard, you are there. I was looking for you. Richard, are you hearing me?
Yes, we are hearing you.
Yes, I want to check Professor Richard Taylor. Do you hear me? I see Richard online. I hope. Okay. Richard, you are muted. Just want to be sure. Richard, you are muted. I don't know whether you are hearing me.
Good morning.
Richard, do you hear me? Yes, do you hear me? Yeah, Richard, I see you. I just want to be sure that you are hearing me. You can unmute.
Good morning, Khalees. Sorry, it seems I had my sound off. I'm now there. Good morning.
Yes, I was wondering because I was not hearing you. So let's check. Maybe we start in the next 2 minutes.
That's fine. Yes.
Yeah, we have 25 people online. So the next 2 minutes, Richard will be starting. So just bear with us.
Okay, that's great. Okay.
Let me take this opportunity, ladies and gentlemen, to call this meeting to order. This is the second webinar in a series of monthly webinars that we are holding within the framework of the Water Resources Institute. And we are happy once again to welcome Professor Richard Taylor. Professor Richard Taylor is a professor of hydrogeology at University College London. And you could have read from the invitation, Professor Richard Taylor has done a lot of work in Africa and Uganda in particular. He'll talk a little bit about himself, but he did a lot of work in Uganda in the 90s and 2000s. and he will be sharing with us the work he has been doing in Africa, basically related to groundwater. Many of us are aware that groundwater is a key source of our drinking water in the rural and urban areas. And we are looking at groundwater as a key resource for meeting the sustainable development goals. In Uganda right now, we are looking at groundwater to support many of the upcoming small towns and large towns. And also we are looking at groundwater to support small scale irrigation. And for this talk, we are going to look at groundwater in urban areas, and the title of the presentation is Observed Urban Groundwater Contamination. And of course, from heavy rainfalls, evidence from Uganda and Senegal. I would like to welcome Professor Richard Taylor to take us through his presentation. And I think the presentation and some background documents have already been shared with a number of you. You may have read through, but those who have not received them, you will be able to receive them after this talk. After Richard's presentation, we shall have an opportunity to ask questions and also make contributions. And the aim of this monthly webinar series is basically to learn from each other and also share experiences. So let me invite you, Professor Richard Taylor, to take the floor. You can introduce yourself again so that people know you more and better as you make your presentation. And I will come back later when we are opening up for questions and clarifications. Over to you, Richard.
Thanks very much, Khalis, for that invitation. I will begin by seeking to share my screen. Oh, it says host disabled screen sharing. Can you allow me to share the screen?
Francis, can you give Richard the...
Thank you. He has done so. Thank you. I believe you are now looking at the cover slide, the first slide. Is that correct, Khalis?
Yeah, we see it. Maybe you can put in full presentation mode.
Well, just a moment. Oh, say. I didn't, let me try this. Sorry, just a moment. If anyone has any clues as how best to do that.
I think you are done, Richard, so you can already run the presentation. Yes, I think we are in full presentation mode.
Oh, is that here? No. Sorry, I'm sorry, just for a moment. I'm on. Let me try again. Sorry for this, just a moment. I hadn't intended it for it to be in this mode display settings. If anyone has any, oh, there we are. Sorry. Okay, we are ready. Yes, my name is Richard Taylor. I am a professor of hydrogeology at University College London and began my career working with Khalis in Uganda many years ago. And as of course, as you know, it's easy to fall in love with Uganda, which I did. When I'm not there, I am very often thinking about my friends and in Uganda. And so there is a long period of research, as Khalis mentioned. The most recent focus of my attention in groundwater research in Uganda has been under a project called AfriWatsan. And this was sponsored by the UK government and the Royal Society, with support obviously also from the government of Uganda. Some of the local counterparts, in addition to the ministry that were involved in this research, were at Makerere University. And this was led by Dr. Michael O'War and in geology, and and Robina Kulabako in civil engineering. So today I'll be speaking about observed urban groundwater contamination from heavy rainfall. Some of you who attended the first seminar will be aware of this connection between climate change and heavy rainfall, so that in a warming world, we will have fewer but heavier rainfall events. And in the last seminar, I talked about its implications for groundwater recharge. And today we're going to look at, perhaps you might say, the unfortunate consequence of that also is that we have observed contamination, or how would you call it, the increased or the exposed, really, the vulnerability of shallow groundwater to contamination from heavy rainfalls. And we'll see what you think, but here is the evidence that I'll be presenting on this today. I'll be drawing from the AFRI-Watsan project, which undertook research in Lukaya town. Many of you will know Lukaya from the road to Mbarara from Kampala. And also, and Lukaya town, of course, is a relatively small conurbation or urban settlement. And we'll be comparing that to observations at a kind of a longer term settlement in Dakar in Senegal, which is probably a bit more equivalent to Kampala in Uganda in terms of its size and age. But let me first, I'll first begin with some perhaps obvious to most of you, but I'll just remind ourselves of some of the health consequences of an inadequate water supply, sanitation, and hygiene services, which we collectively know as WASH. We'll then secondly, briefly touch on rapid urbanization and how that presents some key challenges to the pursuit of UN Sustainable Development Goal 6. And so this is, of course, by 2030, access to water and sanitation for all. And recognizing that when we think about this, many of the pathways to realizing this will be via on-site water supply and sanitation services that involve conjunctive use of the shallow subsurface, not only to as a repository for fecal waste, but also as a source of water. And so we'll look at the observations of the threat posed by heavy rainfall. And as I said, I'll be focusing on Lukaya town in Uganda and Dakar in Senegal. And we'll be focused on a kind of lower income area of Dakar known as Thyroid or Chiroy. I will take a break towards the at the end because on that evidence, but then I'll have a bit of a what we might call an epilogue to this talk. So after we've had a bit of a discussion, I just would like to introduce you, if you will, some of you. Maybe some of you are very familiar with this, but there is the use of fluorescence as an instantaneous reagentless method to monitor fecal contamination. And so this might be of interest to some of you. So I'll briefly go into it. It was a technique that we helped to test and develop under the AFRI-Watsan project. So many of us know some of these statistics, but it's worth reminding ourselves that we have a very high infant mortality rates from diarrhea each year, and most of these are in low-income countries, and almost all of these, or the overwhelming majority of these, are attributed to unsafe drinking water and inadequate availability of water for hygiene and a lack of access to sanitation. And perhaps many of you know that the biggest challenge here really is the lack of access to improved sanitation, which is perhaps in the order of 2 to 3 times greater a problem than the lack of access to improved water sources. This inadequate, if you want to call it, sanitation and access to safe water sources is linked, as I said, to this to these problems of high incidence of diarrheal diseases. So, to be fair now to authorities in the provision of these services, is the fact that we have annual urban growth rates of in excess of 4%. And the the areas on the planet where this urbanization is most intense at present, as you can see from the map from the UN below, is primarily
Richard, you are muted. Richard, you are muted. We don't hear you. Check your mic. You are muted. Richard, can you unmute your mic?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, it's okay now. So,
Okay, great. I don't know quite how that happened. Okay. I trust you heard the earlier discussion of the rates of urban growth. Is that correct or no?
yes, we did.
Okay, fine.
Yes, we did.
Yeah. So the context is I'm sitting here in London, and perhaps it may not be known to many is that London actually grew during the 19th century, not during the 20th century. And so
sorry, we seem to be having Richard a challenge. If you can check your presentation again, we don't see it. I think we're having some connection challenges. Richard, in case you are hearing us, you can reshare the presentation. Francis, I guess it is from Richard's side. Is that so?
Is that
Yes.
yes, Doctor.
Yes.
Okay, so let's hold on. I think Richard is having challenges, so hopefully we'll reconnect again. Just bear with us.
Please, Dr. Callis, can you share the presentation?
Yes, Dr. Richard Detailor is the one who's sharing, so he has a connection problem. So we are trying to get him back online.
No, I mean afterwards.
Yeah, we will, yes. The presentation and also some papers. They will be shared. They were shared earlier with those who registered, but they will be shared immediately after. So bear with us as we try to get hold of Richard. I think his network is letting him down, but let's follow up and see.
can you hear me?
Yes, Professor, we can hear you now.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. Okay. Okay, I'll continue. The brief point I wanted to make here is that the rate of growth of cities in Western Europe, and for instance, places like New York, was less than a third of the growth rate that the cities in tropical Africa and some parts of Asia are growing at the moment. And so it presents very serious challenges to the provision of wash services. And that's particularly in the case of, say, and this has led, that challenge has led in many cases, and that rate of growth has resulted in the proliferation of unplanned settlements, for instance, as we can see here in Kisumu. Now, untreated groundwater drawn from wells or springs provides low-cost access to safe water. And in the figures here, you can see Robina Kulabako at we might call it the relatively famous Boise Spring close to Makerere University in Kampala. And above, you can see some of the infrastructure for the use of urban groundwater for water supply in the Chairoy area of Dakar. In addition, sanitation, on-site technologies, pit latrines, septic tanks, they also provide what you might say relatively quick and low-cost access to sanitation. And these both, whether it's a pit latrine indicated by the figure on the left, or whether it's a septic tank. I should say the septic tank that you can see on the right, not normally is it exposed at the surface, and not normally should it have such a an unsealed cap as it does here. But at least you can visualize it now here more directly, and this is here in the Chairoy area of Dakar. And again, both of these rely on the ability of the subsurface to attenuate the fecal waste associated with these sanitation services. And so the big question in the use of on-site low-cost technology is, how do we sustain this conjunctive use of the subsurface, both for on-site water supply and also for sanitation? And I guess the other question that we've been wondering in the research that we've been engaged in is, how resilient are these on-site water supply and sanitation systems to heavy rainfall, which is being amplified in our warming world? Some early work that I was involved in with colleagues at university, including Robina Kulabako, we showed that through high frequency monitoring of spring discharges, and what we found was that heavy rainfalls, and when the IPCC, for instance, defines heavy rainfalls as those in excess of 10 millimeters per day, and that we found that during periods of heavy rainfall, it coincided with quite rapid but brief contamination, gross really, fecal contamination of springs in Kampala. And so it highlighted really how vulnerable these systems are to contamination. But one of the interesting public health messages that came out of this is that, generally speaking, the water quality from the springs is of a reasonable to good quality, but that it is immediately following heavy rain events where the quality is more suspect and risky. And so this now provides a kind of public health message that, for instance, immediately following heavy rainfalls, it's probably best practice to ensure that you boil the water that you take from springs. So it's understanding that it's not necessarily dismissing shallow groundwater as a resource to be used, but recognizing that there are risks associated with this, and some mitigation of the risk may be involving sort of boil water advisories. More recently, we've been conducting research under an AFRI-WATSAM project, and I'll be presenting some work, but I must say the hardworking people that presented the results here come from some PhD students who I'll introduce in a moment. But I just want the photographs are here designed to give you a kind of a context of the kind of work that was took place, involving hydrogeologists, civil engineers involved in sanitation, and also epidemiologists and public health experts trying to recognize the risks and associated with fecal contamination. And this involved colleagues in Kisumu, in Kenya. It also involved colleagues in Dakar, and also here, of course, in Lukaya. In Uganda, This involved both working with the ministry and National Water and Sewerage Corporation, and particularly the research was led by Makerere University. And I believe I've mentioned Michael O'War and Rabina Kulabako in particular in the past, but I should also introduce Jacinta Naibari, who is now on faculty at Chiambogo University, who was the PhD student at Makerere University, who led much of the field activity in Lukaya town. And we will come into Dakar a little bit later, and you'll be introduced to the work of Abdullah Pouye, a PhD student at University Cheikh Anta Diop, and he's due to defend his PhD thesis in the next month or two. Let's first of all start with Lukaya. In the last seminar, I actually received a query from Ron Slutz, who was asking about, well, are the observations that you have taken from Lukaya really representative of the weathered basement rocks, weathered crystalline rocks that cover much of Uganda? And I think he was under the impression that many of the sites we have been taken of were within the Quaternary alluvium. What I wanted to do is, you can see from the current map showing the water sources that were sampled in Lukaya town, these are dominantly on the weathered basement, as you can see in this map. And while quaternary sediments associated obviously with changes in the level of Lake Victoria certainly are important in this area, they don't actually underlie Lukaya town, and they are not explicitly ones that we sampled, although we had a few locations, as you can see, within the quaternary sediments, lacustrine sediments that are indicated to the right of the map in front of you. So we, well, I say we, a royal we, led by Jacinta Naibari, there was surveys of on-site water supplies, and we found that there were 67 sources within Lukaya town, and many of these, the majority of these, are shallow wells, less than 30 meters in depth. There are also some unprotected springs, and in this same area, there were in excess of 2,000 pit latrines. The town has an area of about 38 square kilometers, and this is a population density of about 640 people per square kilometer. And as you can see here, it's predominantly underlain by weathered crystalline rocks, although to the east side of Lukaya, we move into alluvial and lacustrine sediments from the Quaternary. So this was the study area context here in Lukaya. Many of you may have driven through Lukaya on your way to Mbarara. And I'll now just move on and just remind ourselves, when we talk about safe water, that these have recently, not so recently, but a few years ago, these have been redefined by the joint monitoring program of the World Health Organization and UNICEF. So in the past, we used to talk about access to safe water or not. And now access to safe water has been divided into a number of categories, because we realize it's perhaps not quite as simple as that. And so we have 4 categories defining access to safe water, and that is, or not. And that is safely managed drinking water from an improved water source located on premises, available when needed, and free from fecal and chemical contamination. You might say safely managed water supplies are really our ultimate goal. An interim situation is what we might call basic service, where drinking water from an improved water source and collection time is not more than 30 minutes per round trip. Limited access to drinking water is from an improved water source, but collection time exceeds 30 minutes. And we can appreciate that lineups in the morning or in the evening in some improved water sources pushes what might be basic access to more what we defined as limited access. And then the lack of access or an unimproved source is where drinking water sources are not protected against contamination. And this might be for instance, unprotected dug well or spring. Anyway, I thought it was important to reassert what those definitions are. And we will now look at the categories of those services in the context of Lukaya. So from detailed work that was led by Jacinta Naibari in Lukaya town, we found that the sanitary risks were quite considerable from inadequate maintenance of wells and pit latrines, and that these were and are widespread. Another problem that was encountered was frequent flooding and the persistence of stagnant water. So in essence, inadequate drainage around shallow water wells, and these as increasing the risks of these as safe water sources. So 90% of the water sources were classified as an improved water source, with 67% of these as basic, and the remaining third as limited. And so the difference between these two really focused on observed waiting times for people to get access to that improved water source. Less than half of the pit latrines were classified as an improved service, and that had to do with the quality of construction and the nature of the pit latrines themselves and the nature of the construction. Perhaps an important take-home message that comes from this is more than half of the improved water sources demonstrated gross fecal contamination by E. coli at some point during the sampling periods or during the period of observation. And I suppose this is a somewhat sobering point, because from the World Health Organization and UNICEF's joint monitoring program, we would actually classify all these people using these sources as having access to water, safe water. But actually is that the water isn't consistently safe. And so this is reminds us that although people may have access to an improved water source, it doesn't guarantee the safety of that water. If we now look in the next slide around the situation around rainfall. So sampling of 32, so more than half of the shallow wells during the wet season, and this is the short rains in April, May. There is an important point here. The upper plot in the right of this slide shows variations in the monthly rainfall. And you can see April and May within this time series are the months with the highest rainfall totals in the order of 200 millimeters in those months. And this is in 2018. And so there was a repeated sampling of these sources in April and May, and that's rounds 1 to 4 as indicated here. And then there were follow-up monitoring in June, and that's rounds 5 and 6. And these data are now presented in the plot in the lower right corner here. So the wet season, of course, is rounds 1 to 4. The dry season, or the short dry season, is constitute rounds 5 and 6. I think what should be clear here is that we have in round 1, so sampling at the beginning of the rainy season, we found some fecal contamination. And then over the course of that rainy season, that fecal contamination began to reduce, indicated by the box plots. And then you can see in round 4, there was a distinct rise in the magnitude of fecal contamination. And this followed heavy rainfalls that took place in May 2018 before that sampling round. And so the key point here to essentially make is that the water quality was impaired following heavy rainfalls. And if we now look, if you will, at the hydraulics of this, what you can see is that if we look it's the period 1 of this time series, and you can see in period 1 in May 2018, there was a very sharp rise in the groundwater levels in response to, if you follow it further down, very high daily rainfall in excess of 40 millimeters in a day. And so what we saw was a rapid piezometric response here to heavy rainfalls. And these are associated with those sampling round 4. And what we're seeing is really the vulnerability of groundwater contamination. And so we're not only seeing, if you want to call it, a fecal response to heavy rainfalls, we can see a hydraulic response in the groundwater levels to that heavy rainfall. If you now follow the monitoring of groundwater levels since May 2018, you can see whenever you have heavy rainfalls in excess of 10 millimeters per day, there are sharp rises in piezometric responses that occur. And so the point really I'm trying to make here is how the hydraulic response indicates that flow of infiltrating recharge reaching the water table, and that is bringing, as we see, fecal contamination from essentially the surface to the wells themselves. We'll now interrogate this a little bit more with some evidence from Senegal. So in the map on the screen, in the upper left corner, you will see the Cape Verde Peninsula. And Dakar itself is on the far west or far left side of this peninsula. And you might say the arm really of the peninsula, the area marked in the box in red, represents, if you will, a kind of suburban Dakar. And it's in suburban Dakar, the Chairoy suburb, where lower income communities dominate. And this Chairoy suburb has about 1.5 million inhabitants, a population density that is far greater than that we observed in Lukaya, where it was around 640 people per square kilometer. So we're looking at about 15 times that population density in this suburb, around over 9,000 people per square kilometer. And the geology is that underlies these communities is a unconfined quaternary sand aquifer. And these people are served by on-site sanitation services. We've mapped about 250,000 septic tanks over this area of about 520 square kilometers. And the densities of the septic tanks range from 1 to about 70 per hectare. So that's 100 meters by 100 meters. I should say that urban groundwater withdrawals, urban groundwater used to be the dominant water supply to Dakar. But the use of urban groundwater has radically reduced, in part due to contamination from fecal waste. And so they now blend, if you will, local groundwater with imported groundwater and even surface water for pipe water supplies. But in the community of Chairoy, on-site urban wells still remain active, or still being used. And when we look at the water quality in these wells in the Chairoy area, what we can see is here the plots indicate observed fecal contamination of shallow groundwater by nitrate and E. coli. And the first three plots, A, B, the upper two plots and the lower left corner represent different times when nitrate was sampled, and then that is combined with the on the lower right corner with E. coli sampled over periods from 2017 to 2019. So we have some sense of where the contamination of fecal contamination is highest. You can see that the nitrate concentrations are in excess in places of 500 milligrams per liter. So the drinking water quality guideline is 50. So we are seeing contamination by nitrate of up to 10 times that beyond the recommended limit. If we now look at the relationship, if you will, between the density of on-site sanitation and groundwater quality, that is indicated here. So the mapping, you will call it perhaps in shades of brown, shows you where essentially the septic tanks occur in this Chairoy area, and in that arm, if you will, of the peninsula in the middle, where the densities of septic tanks are highest. Now, We can now see a kind of, if you want to call it a bit of a black box scenario. So we know where we have the highest densities of septic tanks, and we know where the groundwater is contaminated and there's a spatial association. But the processes by which this occurs have remained unclear. And what we have seen, for instance, is the ability of the quaternary sands to attenuate the fecal loading from septic tanks below a guideline value of, say, 50 milligrams per liter. It suggests that you really cannot cite more than 4 or 5 septic tanks per hectare. And of course, the number in many cases, particularly in the central area of the Chiroy, is much greater than 4 or 5 septic tanks per hectare. Now, some curious research. We set up an observatory, and this was led by Abdullah Pouye and at the University Cheikh Anta Diop in Dakar. And this urban observatory took place at a school where we had hourly monitoring of rainfall, soil moisture, and groundwater levels beside a very large septic tank that was associated with a series of toilets being used by a primary school. In the lower part, you can see the kind of the setup of this facility, and where we have a septic tank, in which there was a leaky septic tank releasing water into the subsurface. And you can see here in the unsaturated zone above the water table, we have sampling ports here for looking and monitoring changes in soil water, and not only the soil water content, but also the soil water quality or soil moisture quality. And I'll show you some of those data in the next slide. So the upper plot with the kind of inverted axis, you can see rainfall going down. The greatest event in this we're going to focus on, and that's the one that's actually in the 27th of August in 2020. And that's in the upper right of this plot, where you see the greatest rain event over that time series. And I hope what is clear is when you look at the changes in soil moisture over this 2020, that's the blue lines at different depths. You can see a very sharp increase in soil moisture observed on this date. And you can also see that, generally speaking, similar to the situation in Lukaya, in the bottom plot, we are looking in the black time series. What we are looking at is changes in groundwater levels over time. And I hope it's clear again that some of these distinct rises in groundwater levels are associated with heavy rainfalls. Now, what we did is looked at the soil water quality and sampling soil moisture. So that's the water that's moving from the surface, from the septic tank, down to the water table. And if we look at this time series of data here with depth versus nitrate concentrations, what we can see is the red dots at different line at different depths on the 21st of August show nitrate concentrations at their lowest. They're still high, don't get me wrong, they're still high, but they're at their lowest. So values ranging, say, between 100 and, say, 250 milligrams per liter in the soil moisture itself. Then on the 27th and 28th of August, associated with heavy rainfalls in excess of 51 and 12 millimeters. So 51 millimeters, and the rainfall kind of extended into the next day. And the total rainfall on the second day was 12 millimeters. And what we see is a radical increase in the nitrate concentrations in soil moisture, going up to in excess of 2,000 milligrams per liter. And then a few days later, we sample again the soil moisture, and you can see it has receded back down. Okay, it hasn't gone back down to the red values, but the yellow dots and lines represent nitrate concentrations in the soil moisture on the 1st of September. My point in showing you these data is the idea that that heavy rainfall essentially is flushing fecal waste in the form of, and indicated by the nitrate values, from the fecal waste in this septic tank. So some kind of concluding thoughts here really is the research both in Lukaya and Dakar has shown the vulnerability of shallow groundwater to fecal contamination. And this is associated with heavy rainfalls observed, heavy rainfalls being greater than 10 millimeters per day, observed in Lukaya and in the Chiroy area of Dakar. I suppose one thought we can say is that it exposes really the fragility of on-site water supply and sanitation systems, where current monitoring and maintenance are inadequate. A rather sobering thought in Lukaya, for instance, is to recognize the potential misrepresentation of access to safe water, where improved water sources, as defined under the Joint Monitoring Program, exhibit gross fecal contamination in the presence of on-site sanitation that is largely in Lukaya unimproved, or dominantly unimproved. In Dakar, we can see how heavy rainfalls briefly, they saturate the soil surface and flush fecal contaminants from septic tanks that are inadequately sealed, in this case, through the unsaturated zone to the underlying groundwater. So we can now see, why does Dakar have such high concentrations of nitrate in its groundwater? Well, it's being regularly, from heavy rainfalls, flushed from its septic tanks into that underlying shallow groundwater. In the last seminar, we focused on the fact that in a warming world, we're going to experience a transition to fewer but heavier rainfalls. And I mentioned to you last time that this is most pronounced in the tropics. And so this trend is really expected to amplify the risk of fecal contamination of shallow groundwater sources. So, some thoughts. Urgent investment is required in the governance, regulation, and operation of on-site water supply and sanitation systems in order to reach UN SDG 6, that target of safely managed urban water supply and sanitation services by 2030. I think one thing, just maybe to follow up on that, is we often think of sewerage and piped water supply as perhaps in Uganda, the responsibility of something like the National Water and Sewerage Corporation, and perhaps the responsibility more broadly of government. And when communities themselves, or perhaps with some assistance from government, are producing hand-pumped wells, protecting springs, or developing pit latrines or even septic tank facilities, these on-site services, my view is, and I could be wrong, but my view is government often sees that as really not their responsibility. That's the responsibility of citizens to maybe maintain those. And I guess what I'm trying to say here is, what about recognizing whether or not the communities themselves have the capacity to regulate, monitor, maintain these facilities? And if, for instance, government is going to take credit for improved access to safe water and sanitation that is achieved through on-site facilities, perhaps it needs to rethink and get better involved, particularly in cooperation with local government, in the management and maintenance of these facilities. Maybe that's something we can debate or discuss. One thing clear from the science is that the sustained conjunctive use of the subsurface for water supply and sanitation is in many cases challenged by inadequacies in sightings, design, construction, and the maintenance of facilities. This is not a wholesale criticism of what's going on, just recognition that we need to keep kind of an eye on the quality and of the siting, design, and construction and maintenance of these facilities. And when we think of it, thinking of it as community hygiene, and is there a possible case of collective disresponsibility where everybody thinks everybody else is actually doing something about it, but ultimately nobody is actually doing anything about it. But anyway, we can maybe do that as part of the discussion. And I'm thinking, might we, looking forward, find potential solutions that might emerge from community-based schemes in the private sector? For instance, we may be familiar, I don't know the current context in Kampala, but I know in Nairobi, for instance, there are people like, they call them sanipreneurs. So these are entrepreneurs trying to think of, if I can use the word poo as product, and the idea of harvesting fecal waste perhaps as fertilizer or using it as an energy source in the form of bricks, but thinking more creatively about how we can move forward. Because the idea of universal sewerage and in-house piped water supplies, although this may ultimately be the goal at times, we have to ask ourselves when and where such facilities may ultimately be there. And if we're looking at reaching our UN Sustainable Development Goal 6, we have to think pragmatically about how we may do that in the next 7 years. I think I'll take a break now for questions, and then later I can just fill you in with some slides about fluorescence. So I will now hand that back to the chair.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Richard Taylor, for this very, very interesting presentation on urban groundwater contamination from heavy rainfall and getting evidence from Uganda and Senegal. So bringing the message back home to Rukaya in Uganda, you did give us an overview and made a case why groundwater contamination is a challenge in urban areas, and of course indicating that the challenge is going to even get worse as impacts of climate change are felt. You gave us some statistics and observations of what has been done in Uganda and in Senegal. And also you made some real observations and also some recommendations on what needs to be done to address this issue. So thank you very much. We are going to open up for any comments. And I already see some hands up, and I'm happy to welcome my friend and colleague, Mr. Davis Kavagi. Mr. Davis, happy to see you. And maybe before you make your comment or question, you introduce yourself so that we know who you are. And the others will follow, do the same. So Davis, over to you.
Thank you, Calist. It's a pleasure actually to be reconnecting. My name is Levis Kavagi. I'm working with the United Nations Environment Program, UNEP, in Nairobi, in the Regional Office for Africa. I head the Ecosystems and Biodiversity Unit or program, under which the portfolio of water resources management falls. And we have a bit of work on groundwater. The current one, we are doing a study for Dodoma. As you know, Dodoma is the capital of Tanzania. It's a young city, now poised for growing. And 100%, if I'm not wrong, of its water source would be groundwater. So some of the concerns we have put in the study question is the issue of contamination of groundwater, both present and scenario setting for future. Thank you, Prof, for very good and illustrative presentation on the two studies in Uganda and Senegal. I just have a brief question. You mentioned about septics and the density of septic per hectare. What is the size of these septics that you are looking at? I didn't, maybe I missed that particular point. What is the volume of these septics? Are they household level? Are they communal level? If you may just give some clarity on that. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Davis, for this. Maybe let's take a few more before Richard comes in. Any other people? Yes. Dr. Maha, over to you again. Introduce yourself so that we know who you are before you raise your question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Good morning, Dr. Richard. Thank you for the very informative presentation. Groundwater is the basic thing now, especially for drinking water supply in urban and in remote areas. Thank you very much. My name is Maha Abdul Ismail. I am the Groundwater Project for Nile Basin Initiative Technical Lead. My question is, as we all know that hand pumps for shallow wells are not a permanent setup. They are usually a temporary setup to serve emergency purposes. That is why they are usually replaced by standard facilities and protected facilities. But why do we keep having them for a long time, especially in Eastern Africa and even in Sudan, my country? I think we need to talk about solutions. For example, the detection of contact zone, and number two, what are the contaminant transport pattern? And number three, if there are any engineering solutions, like how can we improve the septic tanks if we cannot have a contaminant treatment plants centrally located or anything? How can we improve the septic tanks? How can we improve the protection of the water sources? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Maha, for those questions. Professor Taylor is taking note. Let's listen to head reader. Again, introduce yourself before you raise any question or comment.
Yeah, thank you, Doctor, for giving me the opportunity. And thank you, Dr. Taylor, also for the presentation and the study carried out in Rukaya. My name is Edrida Msimbuzi. I'm from Ministry of Water and Environment, Department of Rural Water and Sanitation. This is an interesting research that was carried out in Rukaya, but important is the supply in that town. Indeed, the study is focusing on urban. Most of the urban centers or rural centers in Uganda are made by piped water systems. And in Uganda, like Lukaya itself, is served, most of the population is served by a production well on a site called Bulingo, that is in Lukaya. So I wanted to know what percentage is served by this on-site water supply system, the shallow wells, because from this research, they indicate that it's quite a number, but what percentage is using that? And secondly, on the recommendation given on the urgent investment in regulation and guidance, the Department of Rural Water also guided more than 10 years back to local governments to move away from shallow wells because we already observed that there was a lot of contamination, and now no local government in Uganda is constructing or drilling shallow wells. I wanted to find out whether some of the boreholes tested, whether they were also equally contaminated, because the research is silent on the deep wells of over 30 meters deep. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So maybe let's get responses to these. I also see one chat on the rather comment on the chat. So Richard, maybe you can respond to these. And again, colleagues online can also give their perspectives. So over to you, Richard, for responses on this.
Thanks very much for the excellent questions. I'll maybe take them in the order that they were given. Levis Kavaji, you were asking about the dimensions or size of the septic tanks that were being discussed. In reference to the septic tanks, of course, we were referring to the on-site sanitation facilities underlying the Chairoy area of Dakar. The on-site sanitation facilities in Lukaya are overwhelmingly, more than 95% of them were pit latrines. So in relation to the Chairoy area of Dakar and the dimensions of the septic tanks, the analysis was primarily looking at septic tanks that were for households. Some septic tanks are larger and how would I call it? The general analysis across the Chairoy area was focused, and if you want to call it the census of septic tanks were household scale. There are, however, and that was indicated by the experimental site, there are, however, larger septic tanks that were also considered in the analysis. And these are perhaps, if you were to scale them up, these are sort of 4 to 5 times the size of the septic tanks that you would typically have at a household scale. Some of them are perhaps even about maybe up to 10 times that size, but they are, none of them are, let's say, very, very big, but they're predominantly that we were speaking of household, with slightly larger ones that were serving institutions, including schools. Maybe just to finalize some of that, one of the big challenges in the Chairoy area of Dakar is, if you want to call it, the evacuation of the removal, or if you want to call it the harvesting of the fecal waste that is contained in those septic tanks. And what they're moving away from in Dakar is very large treatment facilities for that fecal waste, and moving to community scale sewage treatment, in which, again, a little bit aligned to experiences in Nairobi, is trying to turn fecal waste into a usable product. And that's the context in Dakar. So I hope that answers your question. I would like to follow up with you about Dodoma, but that's another, that comes in. Yes, you are correct that it's dominantly coming from groundwater in Dodoma, but maybe we can follow up separately on that. Dr. Maha has a question on shallow wells, and one of the issues, and it was also in part followed up with Adrita's comment on perhaps the idea that shallow wells are kind of a stopgap or an emergency services, and why do we continue to use these facilities in the urban context? I have kind of a couple of responses to this point. On the contamination pattern, perhaps what I hope you got from the presentation is the vulnerability of shallow groundwater to heavy rainfall events. But what I would like to point out is, and perhaps is unexplored here, and this also partially addresses Adrita's question, is we don't have to give up on the shallow groundwater. My view is the problems associated with the contamination of that shallow groundwater are, in many cases, a subject of the maintenance of facilities at the surface. So whether it's the pit latrines and their construction, or it's how well the seals are on the wells themselves. And I can point out to Adrita that even in deep wells, we are seeing comparatively rapid contamination of those sources. But I'll come to that point in a question. So in terms of the engineering solutions that might be associated with improving the quality of water from these sources, I guess the point I was trying to make there, and it's really my second point in the slide in front of you, is we need to kind of address the issue of the design, construction, and maintenance of these facilities, and then and clearly the follow-up. Because if these facilities were better maintained, the expectation is that the quality of the shallow groundwater would be less at risk to contamination. And that shallow groundwater represents an important low-cost source. And the reality that perhaps goes to the beginning of the presentation was we have comparatively rapid rates of urbanization, and we have people obviously doing levels of self-supply for their water supply, but we don't have to give up necessarily, is my view, on the on shallow groundwater and say, for instance, let's give up on it, forget it. No shallow groundwater, we only use deep groundwater. I think the possible risk there is you begin to assume that the deep groundwater is, well, clearly on some levels it's going to be better protected, but it may still be vulnerable to this form of contamination. So the real question is, if you improve community hygiene at the surface, and we have better, if you want to call it, regulation and inspection and checking, we can be improving the quality or reducing the risk of contamination, not only to shallow groundwater, but also to deep groundwater. Now to address Adrida's question on Lukaya. Okay, so Adrida, I did not personally undertake the surveys that were done in Lukaya. That was done by Jacinta Naibari, who did this as part of her doctoral thesis. My understanding is the overwhelming majority of people in Lukaya town use on-site water supply services. They do not use the borehole, which I'm very familiar with, provided by the National Water and Sewerage Corporation. And this gets back to an earlier point. And the main reason for that is cost. The cost is simply beyond that for which the community is there. So I think one of the things that might be, if I have a follow-on recommendation, is that we need, and this is something that would involve government, is we need to have a better recognition between ability and willingness to pay and what we can reasonably expect to receive from the communities who need this water supply. And so, yes, there is a borehole at the in Lukaya town, and there is a piped water. There is the facility, if you will, for piped water supplies, but the uptake is certainly much less than desired. And the majority of people in Lukaya town, as I understand it, I can see this may be contested, but we can follow up with the evidence collected by Jacinta Naibari, is that the overwhelming majority of people in Lukaya town use water from shallow wells rather than from the piped facility that exists there. Now, I guess just to follow up the point is, I recognize, of course, we want to have better protected water supplies, but perhaps the one point I'm making here is maybe to focus a little bit more on trying to prevent the source of that contamination by improved sanitation facilities, rather than saying, well, let's not really mind much about what's happening at the surface. It's very difficult to control that, very difficult to maintain. Let's just build deeper wells. And yes, that is, if you want to call it, an adaptive solution. But maybe there is, in light of the low cost associated with the use of that shallow groundwater, maybe there are ways to focus on improved management of the fecal waste to restrict the magnitude of that contamination. I'm happy to discuss that further, but those are my responses to the first three questions.
Richard, there were a few issues in the chat. You may have I don't know, are you able to check the chat? So
yes, I'm looking at the chat now, and I'll go to the beginning, and now I'll now go down. Yes, this will remain a challenge. Do you get it? Yes, again, maybe I'll let others with better understand locally talk about the situation in Luzira with the prepaid water meters. Maybe there are others that I'll now move down. Oh, oops. Between septic tanks and pit latrines, which of the system poses a higher risk of contamination to groundwater? What we are finding is that that both of these can present a risk. Now, when I presented some of this work previously, some people have asked me, well, Richard, can you really call inadequately sealed, we might call them cement boxes in the subsurface, a septic tank? Septic tanks have if they're well engineered, you might call them relatively sophisticated systems in which fecal waste can be deposited. And if they're not constructed properly, then perhaps it's maybe disingenuous, if I can use that word, or it's misrepresentative to say that that box of that concrete box that you put on the subsurface is actually a septic tank. So, so Daniel Kuret, my response is it's sometimes difficult to compare the septic tanks in pit latrines because if the septic tank is inadequately constructed, or the pit latrines are not well sited, or their depths are unreasonable, then we can find that they are both providing. We can find that they're both presenting a risk. So it's relatively. I guess my answer is I don't have a clear and distinct answer to your question. What I can say is we have seen risks posed to the quality of groundwater from both systems, and I really think that it's the maintenance and the design and construction of these facilities that plays a very strong a role in determining whether they present a risk. I would like to know if deep boreholes and above are safer from contamination, and how do we then relate borehole depth to the risk of groundwater contamination? It's a great question. Clearly, when you go deeper, there is a reduced risk associated with the contamination, or in many cases, there will be a reducer, but it doesn't eliminate the risks. And of course, the nature of the geology will play a very important role here. We know, for instance, in fractured rocks, that the attenuation of fecal pathogens, viruses, and bacteria is limited, and actually, it's better if these go through a kind of, if you want to call it, sand-like filter. But in the weathered basement rocks, one of the challenges we have is that the water is often moving via preferential pathways for which attenuation is more limited. So yes, deeper boreholes are less likely to be contaminated, but I think you will not eliminate the risk of that contamination. So that's something to recognize. And obviously that relates to areas around treatment such as chlorination. Okay. That's a good response. Thank you from Tom Mika Matila. I agree. And thank you, Levis, for the email address. I will happily get in touch. Sorry, I'm just leaving down. Yeah, maintenance is a fundamental issue. Thank you, Dr. Maha, for that reply. Okay. Yes, I did not touch on the gender aspects of this because, of course, they are huge, and women and girls are disproportionately impacted by the failures of water supply and sanitation. And of course, if these are contaminated, they face greater risks of or to diarrheal diseases as well. And I agree with Blick Magadi Kennedy around. There is issues here which we cannot ignore around cost. And if, for instance, self-supply in many cases will dominantly focus on the use of shallow groundwater. Now, some might say that the governments are therefore not held responsible for the use of these services. But perhaps there could be greater cooperation between local government and them with self-supply. And as I said before, perhaps we could have a greater focus on the addressing the sources of contamination rather than necessarily suggesting that all shallow groundwater sources are too dangerous for use. Biodigesters. Good question. I don't have expertise in that. Do consult your local civil engineer or your friend or colleagues who are civil engineers. I'm afraid I can't comment on that. Would you recommend on-site chlorine dispensing? I have seen, Adrida, thank you for that. I've seen those facilities a long time ago when I was doing work in Rwanda, where they have dispensers, so like a Venturi system. As soon as you open the tap, it bleeds, if you will, a small amount of chlorine to go into this. One of the big problems with the dispensers, of course, is how well are they maintained and how well are they kept in order. And also there are obviously risks of of that. If you have, I think chlorine dispensing would be perhaps a really good idea in institutions like schools, for instance, and others, or maybe even in hospitals, where you could have someone who is a dedicated technician who would maintain not only the chlorinated, the hypochlorite, sodium hypochlorite, to keep those systems going, but also who would keep an eye that the systems themselves are operating effectively. Obviously, there are issues of cost that go with that as well. But yes, Adrida, in situations of risks of contamination, I think chlorine dispensing is, and particularly if it's a community-based system, again, where someone might be, you might have someone who's dedicated to the maintenance of that facility. Agreed. Underground well contamination is partially related to the distance between the well and the leaking septic tank in the Philippines. That is true. Okay, very good. I agree with you, Dr. Maha. Oh, I do wish we were doing this in person. And there, I guess, on the issue of flooding, and flooding does pose a risk, and so drainage is an important issue. We need one thing to remember as well, is that flooding obviously is poses risks to households and to infrastructure. Flooding also contributing to the replenishment of our groundwater itself. So building facilities in flood-prone areas is not a good idea, and trying to improve the siting of these facilities and the protection of these facilities would be best. I think I've tried to address those questions in the chat, Chair. I'll hand it back to you now.
Okay, thank you very much, Richard, for really responding to all these questions. Again, very, very interesting views being put on the chat. I request everybody to look through and look at the perspectives of the participants. Let's see whether we have any final comments, questions. We should be ending shortly. Anybody who still has a question? If I don't see, I'm checking on the chat, I don't see any hand up, but you can speak out loudly in case you have any question before we end this session. We seem to be okay. I think Richard, oh yes. A few comments. Vicman, true contamination of groundwater is a problem in urban areas in Uganda. Indeed. And of course, Isaac said recommended areas for further research. Yes, indeed. And of course, what Richard has actually indicated, and very, very interesting that. And I think the comments on the chat were clear that people will go in for shallow wells. And then, reader, even if we, as the ministry, have put a ban on shallow wells continue to be constructed. So as long as they are there, and I think the chat has been clear that people are looking for free water. Some people may not pay, may not have the ability to pay, but everybody would want to get free water if it is available. So I think, as Richard mentioned, let's not give up on shallow groundwater. Let's see how we Sorry, colleagues, I think my network had gone off, but I was indicating that as Richard has mentioned, and as the other colleagues have mentioned, people will continue using shallow groundwater. In many urban areas, we see even some of the boreholes which are considered to be deep boreholes, if they are not well protected, they will be contaminated. So I think some of these reflections Richard has put on the table, let's think through them, how to improve governance, collaboration, how do we improve on regulation, how do we improve on operation and maintenance, and also the hygiene conditions around the source. Now, Richard still has two, three slides to make. And probably maybe before Richard comes in, just highlight that the discussion will continue. If you have any issues, you can always raise them, but we are going to end questions at this. So Richard, you can take us through the final slides, and then we'll wind up this session.
Thank you very much. The questions have been great, and I hope it stirs a bit of a conversation on your side. I will now, yes, and thanks for giving me just a brief window here to talk about some research that was done under AFRI-Watson involving Kisumu, Lukaya, and Dakar. And this work was led by someone named Dr. James Sorensen, who at the British Geological Survey, and working with the teams in each of them to test this new analytical facility.
Richard, your network is cutting off. We are missing you.
Oh, okay. Okay. Can you hear me now? Do you hear me now?
Yo.
Yes,
we
can hear you. Okay. Okay, great. I'll So, people might be very familiar with what were called fecal indicator organisms, and this is where you do a membrane filtration method. And these are called culture techniques, where you take a sample, you put it through a filter. The idea is that fecal bacteria such as E. coli are trapped on the filter paper. This filter paper is then put in some culture media and is indicated in the photo on the top right. You then enumerate or count the number of colony-forming bacteria on the slide, and this is known as this is how we typically do this. Now, the one of the downsides of this is you collect the sample in the field or you filter it in the field, and then you have to wait often around, say, 36 hours, often 2 days at least, for the colonies to develop on the filter paper and for essentially the analysis to be conducted. Now, one of the other things is that even a few years ago, the World Health Organization concluded that monitoring using these processes, membrane filtration methods, so enumerating E. coli colonies, is perhaps not the best protection of public health. And they were calling for improved methods. And there is an emerging method on fluorescence. And this is that fecal microorganisms and their they fluoresce at particular wavelengths. Now, this this fluorescence, if you will, of this fecal matter was sort of almost discovered by accident that at a particular wavelength, many of the fecal organisms are fluorescing. They're giving this property. And so people began to think that knowledge of this is about 15 years old, maybe a little bit more. And people begin to think, okay, well, maybe we can exploit this and actually directly measure the fluorescence as a, if you want to call it a proxy for the presence of fecal microorganisms in a water sample. The plot on the lower left shows the relationship between enumerated colonies of thermotolerant coliforms. That we call them thermotolerant because they survive the gut of a warm-blooded animal, and they come out of the gut of a warm-blooded animal. That could be a human, or it could be, for instance, a goat. And you relate that to the what's called tryptophan-like fluorescence. That's what TLF stands for. And you can see there's a very solid relationship here that is indicated by the statistics in the lower left. The device is being used there by Jacinta in the field, and you can see you can use it not only for spot sampling of individual samples, which you can see on the photo on the lower left, but you can also set up a fluorescence facility onto a piped water system as indicated for a community supply in the lower right. By the way, this is the face of James Sorensen, who's been doing this work. And what we see is that both tryptophan-like fluorescence and another type of fluorescence known as human-like, these point very strongly to that wet season contamination. And they therefore provide a kind of more temporally robust measure of the risk of fecal contamination. Let me explain that a little bit, and what's really meant by this. So for instance, you could sample, let's say, a shallow well from Lukaya in the dry season, and it might not show, for instance, its counts for thermotolerant coliforms or E. coli. They may be very low. And you might therefore decide that this source is safe, therefore, for drinking water supplies. But one of the differences is the tryptophan-like fluorescence is able to measure that contamination. And even if they, if you measure it, let's say during the dry season, it actually, because it also, fluorescence also comes from, if you want to call it the decay of those fecal organisms, you will, there will be a presence, a significant presence or indication that this source is contaminated even during periods of when the enumerated bacteria or viruses are low. I guess my point is, if you wanted to go into a new location and you wanted to find out which of these sources is vulnerable and which of these sources is not, the fecal indicator organisms like thermotolerant coliforms, their values go up and down and they waver all over the place. But the tryptophan-like fluorescence, the fluorescent measurements, are a much more smooth indicator of that, and you will have a better idea of the history of contamination of that site. Perhaps the greatest benefit, though, is that you can measure the contamination, the fecal contamination on site. So it means, for instance, you go to a well, you, for instance, take a sample and put it in a beaker, you use the device as indicated here on the lower left, and you can report to that community there and then whether there is a risk of fecal contamination from this site. And that is a huge advantage over sampling in the field. And then this problem of, once you've got the results, how do you communicate those results to all the people who are using that source? To be able to report to the people on instantaneously whether or not their source is has been contaminated by fecal organisms is a huge advantage. And I think, for instance, these kits are, I should point out at the moment, they remain relatively expensive. Somewhere the kits are coming down. There are forms of this kit that are probably available for between, so I'm going to use pounds as a currency, between 400 and 500 pounds. The conventional ones at the moment are still in the order of about 1,500 pounds. But one advantage is it's very robust instrumentation, and you could use this. You imagine you could use this for several years. It does require, you know, regular calibration at different points and testing. But the equipment doesn't require reagents, doesn't require a laboratory, consumables of any kind. It doesn't require, for instance, a lab technician. You don't require an aseptic lab. So it has some very big advantages. Anyway, I wanted you to be aware of this new method, robust method, and I'm happy to speak more about this. But this might prove very, very useful when you are going to new areas and you want to find out what are the risks, where are the risks of water supply, whether you're working with government within the Ministry of Water and Environment, whether you're working at National Water and Sewerage, or for instance, whether you're working within an NGO, working with a new community and you want to understand the threats posed to water supply. I think in terms of time, I've really worn out my welcome, so I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much, Richard, again for sharing this technological development, new development. Again, something to test out and see how it can be used, and also have highlighted its benefits compared also to the other tools. So any quick comments on this and any other issue before we end this talk? Anybody who may have any comment, any question for Professor Richard Taylor before we end? Okay, so Emmanuel, you can raise your comment, question.
Yes, Doctor, I thank you so much for the presentation. I just have a quick comment. We know that water is a universal solvent, and we actually know that it might also be having some fluorescent minerals within it. So when you're using this method to carry out fecal assessments within these boreholes from the water samples collected, how can you be able to differentiate the fluorescent values emitted by the E. coli organisms from those emitted by maybe other variant components within the water? That's what I wanted to know.
That's a great question. That's a great question, Emmanuel. The answer really is this chance observation. I believe it's 260 nanometers, but I'm going to have to go back and check the details. But what they found is consistently fecal microorganisms, including things like Vibrio cholera, they fluoresce at this wavelength. But you find many of the other natural bacteria that don't pose a risk to human health do not fluoresce at this wavelength. And so actually it is a surprisingly accurate indicator of the fecal contamination. And that's why, for instance, this technology has been developed. If, for instance, it couldn't differentiate between fecal bacteria and what we might call natural healthy bacteria that are otherwise in the environment, then it wouldn't have been developed. But it is specific to the fecal microorganisms. Not all fecal microorganisms, but many of the key ones.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we need to bring an end to this talk. Before I close, just to inform all of you online that this has been the second webinar in a series of monthly webinars, and we would like to appreciate Professor Richard Taylor for being our keynote speaker and presenter for the two seminars. He's the one who has kicked off these two seminars. So, Richard, thank you very much. Let's give you a big clap on Ryan.
Thank you. Thank you for hosting me.
Yes, and Richard has a number of other presentations lined up. They will be coming in the coming months. But just to inform the meeting that we'll be having the next webinar on 24th February at 11 a.m. So every last Friday of the month, we'll be having these webinars. So look out for the call and the invitation. And also would want to invite those of you who have some good work you have been doing to share, get in touch with the Secretariat of the Water Resources Institute so that we can share. We'll be bringing work done by the researchers, work by practitioners. So feel free to approach the Secretariat so that you can be scheduled to share. We do believe that there is a lot to share, and we want to take advantage of these monthly webinars so that we can inform each other. But really, I do appreciate the presentation, Richard. It has generated a lot of questions, a lot of inputs. Issue of safe water and sanitation is key. We'll be having the UN Water Conference in New York next month, in March. And these are some of the things that will be discussed, and some of the information that were put on the table certainly will be reflected on as we prepare. I want to thank the Secretariat at the Water Resources Institute, Gwendolyn, Francis, and the team for organizing this webinar. And for all of you who have spared your time to attend, I wish you a nice day. Let's meet again on 24th February for the third webinar in a series of monthly webinars. Thank you very much. And Francis will share the presentations and also the other publications which Professor Richard Taylor has shared. And if Francis doesn't have your email, post it on the chat so that he gets it. Thank you very much and wish you a nice day. Over to you, Richard. I know it is still in the morning. Wish you all the best. We look forward to having you again to talk to us in the coming months. We'll be letting you know. Thank you very much, all of you.
Thank you very much. And if you want to contact me, I've just put my email address in the chat. You may find it in the documents as well. But anyway, thanks very much, and look forward to seeing you again soon.
Okay, good then. Thank you very much.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay, good. Nice day.
Bye-bye.